All right, welcome everyone. Good morning. My name is Kai Kaufman, and I'm a volunteer with the Indigenous Physical Activity and Cultural Circle. Before we begin, just a gentle reminder that all sessions will be recorded. So for those that are tuning in virtually today, we just ask that you please keep your videos and microphones off during the session. Today I'll be introducing Lynette Fisher. Lynette Fisher is a proud Anishinaabe-kwe from Chippewa, the Thames First Nation in Ontario. She was born and raised in the Treaty 4 area and holds a bachelor's degree in secondary Indigenous education with a major in Indigenous studies. Lynette believes in sports medicine in that movement can and does heal the spirit and the mind. She enjoys working with horses and at-risk individuals. Lynette enjoys the peace of mind of the level of self-awareness that is achieved in competitive sports and devotes a great deal of her time to Indigenous youth, coaching and role modeling in hopes that they find the best way to become the greatest versions of themselves. So today, Lynette Fisher will be presenting her presentation on healing grief and trauma through Indigenous athleticism in sports. So please join me in welcoming Lynette Fisher.
Good morning. Very honored and blessed to be here my first time traveling this part of it. I'm going to talk a little bit about our journey, but before I do that, I just want to thank everyone to thank Creator for the heartbeat that's going in my chest and each and every one of you that came here to listen to me share. And I'd like to thank Creator for blessing me with another day and putting the breath in my lungs, because without him and without giving me these gifts every day and waking me up and giving me another opportunity to improve myself and be better, I would be nowhere. So I'm very grateful to Creator for making sure I got here safely, and as everyone else who travels. Let's take that second to acknowledge him. Yes, so I'm here to share with you today about healing grief and trauma through Indigenous athleticism in sports. So what I'm going to talk about today is there's going to be some times in my presentation where I'm going to have to get very vulnerable and very, very open about the things that I've experienced as a young Indigenous person and an Indigenous woman. As we move along, if there's any questions at any time, please don't feel like you need to wait till the end. I will give you time at the end, but it's okay to stop me at any time if you have questions. So we can move forward, please. Thank you to my assistant. It goes so important. That's amazing. So to get started, what exactly is grief and trauma? Why do so many Indigenous individuals experience grief and trauma? So the textbook definition of what you're going to find about grief is it's the overwhelming sorrow experienced by an individual. Stages of grief can include stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Individuals experience the stages of grief in no certain order and can become lost in a continuous loop, affecting performance and quality of life. So for each one of us, we've all experienced some sort of grief. We've all experienced a loss. We've all experienced something that's gone deep into our soul, right? And it really, really affects how we see things, how we perceive ourselves, how we relate to people, how we try to find our purpose. Everything can literally be turned upside down. I remember many, many times in my life when I was in extreme grief, I felt like the world was moving too fast. I don't know if you've ever had that feeling, like I just needed everything to slow down. I couldn't keep up. I couldn't keep up when I was in grief. I felt like everybody was moving so fast, work was moving so fast, time was moving so fast. I remember times being deep in my own grief and watching people laugh and watching people smile and have a good time. And I wanted that so bad. I was so lost in it. I was so lost under this grief. And if anyone knows anything about the ducks, so ducks on the water, they look so smooth, right? They look like they're just floating around, they're doing duck things, doing duck business. But underneath the surface, you don't see how fast they're pedaling, they're moving their feet, they're just trying to keep up, right? They're trying to stay afloat. That's a lot of what grief can be like for others. On the surface, we don't really know what's going on, right? They look good, everything looks good, they're functioning, but we don't know what's happening underneath. So can I get rid of them who ever felt that immense grief? Good, I'm not alone, so everyone knows how that feels. Moving along, trauma. Trauma is the result of exposure to incidents or events that extremely disturbing and have lasting effects on an individual's sense of self, beliefs, and behaviors. So the difference between grief is a loss, trauma is an experience. So as a young Indigenous woman, I experienced a lot of trauma as a child and in my younger years. I continue to experience trauma, I continue to relive my traumas. These are all things that I have to make a conscious effort to deal with all the time. So with trauma, a lot of our Indigenous youth are experiencing trauma. I will share that what I have found, I was born in 1984. In that time, there was no cell phones. I could be sent outside and go and play for hours. And there was dangers, right? We had to be careful. But now as a mother, I have an extension. There's so much turmoil in the world. There's so much violence. There's so much addiction. There's so many tempting things that can lure our children away from us and off the path at any given moment. So I feel a lot of stress towards that as a parent. So why do so many Indigenous individuals experience grief and trauma? Well, a lot of those things are what we're all familiar with. It's residential school, colonialism, the 60s school, constant racism, being pushed to the fringes of society, violence against Indigenous women. You know, the list goes on and on. And I don't feel like that's something that I need to educate everyone in this room about, but we're aware of those things. Looking further into that a little bit, lifestyle and quality of life. So a lot of our Indigenous people are experiencing poverty. That in itself is very, very true. There's a lot of things going on. Our nation's not having clean drinking water. The nearest hospitals being further and further away. I was very, very blessed at one time to teach in Northern Ontario. In Sioux Lookout, that was the base of the school was in Sioux Lookout, but a lot of the kids were coming down from the northwestern communities. So these are flying communities. And the stories that I would hear from children there, students who, you know, seeing people be subject to gunshot wounds and having to be flown out by helicopter. The helicopter can't come because there's a storm, there's this, there's that, and they have to nursing station. These were very, very traumatic experiences. I was very lucky in my life to not have to experience that, but working with students, I've compiled a lot of things in my mind that help me understand how different it is in every community, right? Every community we go to has its own struggles, however, we have the same struggles. Please. So, laying the foundation, we understand what grief and trauma is and where it comes from. Trauma and grief settle deep in the body, very, very deep in the body. So they settle in the nervous system, they settle in the cells, they settle in our organs, they settle in our mind. All of these experiences, this grief, this sorrow, these incidences we're exposed to. A lot of it will come up as anxiety. We see a lot of our young students now, our young people who aren't able to partake in sports, aren't able to participate in classrooms because they have overwhelming anxiety. And that wasn't so much of a thing. Anxiety has always been around. It's been around as long as we've been around. But today, mental health is at an all-time high. Right? What our students are experiencing, our young people, and not just our young people, but people in general. We're experiencing a lot more. We're seeing a lot more of an anxiety issue. At any given time, as a teacher, we see anxiety. And the more I move around, I see a lot of anxiety in every teacher. I myself experienced crippling anxiety at some points in my life. And how I've worked with that is, everybody's seen the National Geographic. Has everyone ever seen, or maybe something similar to this, when a cheetah is flying after a gazelle, and the gazelle gets lucky that day, right? The gazelle makes it, gets away from the cheetah, comes off, right? here's what a lot of what we don't see is when the gazelle breaks free and has its life for the day, what the animal does is tremors. They shake, right? They shake. As human beings, because of the pressure of our society to look a certain way, to behave a certain way, what society tells us is makes us worthy as a person is never having those shakes, never having those traumas, right? It's not okay if you fall apart. You can't do that. You got bills to pay, you got children to raise, you got this, you got this, you got this. It's not okay, nobody has time. So we've lost our ability to let out that adrenaline. We've lost our ability to say, okay, she didn't get me today. I'm going to take a minute here and just let that out. So we've lost our ability to do that because of our perception. Everything that's pushed on our mind about how we got to look, how we got to be, how we got to behave. So anxiety, I can have an anxiety attack today that my nervous system has been storing since I was 7 years old. It is really, really fascinating how long your body will hold that memory. And what I tell young people and what I have learned in the midst of a panic attack or an anxiety, if you're completely safe, everything is fine, everything is well. You just need to understand that now is the time that your body is saying, okay, we got to let something out. Seems like a good time. And it's really unfortunate that our bodies will do that at the most inopportune times for us. Things can be going well, great day, yay, everything's fun. Oh my God, woo. And you got to take a minute, you got to take a walk. You got to understand that, the mind tries to tell us that we're in danger, right? But because of trauma and grief, the way that the body stores those experiences, they can come up years from now. Your body will store that for a long time and need it to come up. We can also get stuck in the loop, right? Like I was talking about, we can get stuck in those loops of grief. Experience these things, trauma and grief, also equal up to self-limiting beliefs. Self-limiting beliefs. So from 0 to 7 years old, our body, what it does, our mind, creates these patterns. So if we experience trauma and grief at those times in our lives, what our mind is going to do is it's going to create pathways and beliefs and behaviors to try to protect us from ever having those experiences again. Because as children, we cannot process those emotions, we cannot process those experiences. So if we're talking about Indigenous children, for example, residential school survivors, at 0 to 7 years old, experiencing some of the things that they have experienced, the mind puts together ways to protect themselves from ever having that experience again. Now, as children, we're not able to identify these beliefs. We're not able to identify how our body and our mind is trying to protect ourselves. But it's there. A large part of me dealing with my trauma and grief was learning how to be present. Really learning how to be present today. And when I started taking a personal inventory of why I was stressed out, why I was having anxiety, why I didn't believe that I was going to get anywhere in life, why was all this stuff going on, I was able to kind of trace that at that time in my life, I was okay. I was okay. It was doing well. I was sober. I made it into adulthood. There was a time when my family really, really sincerely believed that they would have to visit me at the Maple Creek Women's Detention Center, and they never had to do that. They didn't have to hire lawyers for me and keep me out of trouble. And there was always things that were well in my life. See, why wasn't I? Why wasn't I? I mean, it looked well, but I wasn't. So a lot of these I had self-limiting beliefs, self-sabotage. The mind will get stuck in this negative place where, as children, let me back it up. Has anybody read Brahma Puppet Ghost with Gabor Mate? So, as children, a fetus in the womb, when a mother is breastfeeding, one of the very, very few things that can pass through the placenta and touch a baby is cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Of all things, children can experience stress in the womb, but it goes deeper than that. So if we have a young mom, say an Indigenous woman, who's very, very young, unprepared, experiencing violence, maybe addiction, chaos, during her pregnancy, like my mother, you have a baby who's being bathed in cortisol, bathed in the stress hormone, because her stress level was high. So I was preconditioned to seek out chaotic symptoms, chaotic situations. So as a young woman, when I moved into having my own relationships and running my own household, I didn't know what to do unless we were all in crisis. That felt normal because it's what I experienced in the womb. I had to learn to come to a place to step away from these self-sabotaging behaviors and learn what peace and love and routine and consistency and respect and self-care really were. Because I never had that right from when I was with my mother. She was carrying me. So a lot of this grief and trauma touches a child in the womb. It's not necessarily once they get out and they meet someone who abuses them or starts experiencing things in the world. From an Indigenous perspective, we have strong teachings about women who are carrying children. There was a time when women who were experiencing pregnancy, everybody around them didn't swear, was never angry. When a woman who was carrying a child stepped into the room, everybody made a point to become calm and relaxing because of the respect for what was happening. That was a ceremony, right? We got away from those teachings, obviously, colonialism, residential school, the breakdown of our families and nations. So we've stepped away from that. So a lot of our children are being bathed in cortisol, being bathed in chaos as babies, and coming out. That's what we know. That's what we look for. But there's ways around this. There's ways of healing these things. Trauma and grief also will lead to addictions. The escapism of trying to get away from the food, right? Addiction, if you know Gabor takes, is that addiction isn't a problem, it's the symptom. It's the symptom of trauma and grief and pain. Because children at a very, very young age, when they're born under those kind of pressures, like themselves, born under those kind of pressures, I remember at 10 years old being so tired of life, and just wanting to feel better. By 13 years old, I was active in very, very active. Of course, a decreased quality of life. You're experiencing trauma and grief, which is a natural process. Sometimes you can't get away from those things, right? Life happens. People pass away, accidents happen. Horrific things happen around us. We cannot get away from them, but it also decreases our quality of life when we're in trauma, in grief. And also leading to disease and pain. So from an Indigenous perspective, the healers that I have worked with, and I've had to work with many because I've experienced an onslaught of early diseases and pain, is that we don't necessarily catch sicknesses. It's the state of our body that becomes a reaction to what's going on around us. So I have a running inventory, and people love to come to me and say, okay, I'm having a real knee problem here. And it's coming from the hip, it's all the way down, and it's aching. And I'm like, okay, tell me more. When did it start? Okay. So what decision are you worried about making? And they say, well, I'm trying to decide between this job or this job. I'm trying to decide between this and this. Okay, literally, your body is telling you you need to take the next step. That's your body's reaction. Fever is usually anger. Heart attacks are usually anger. Diabetes, which is very, very prominent in our First Nations culture. You can Google this and test me on it. If you look up the spiritual cause of diabetes, it is an overwhelming sense of grief and loss. So why would First Nations people be such a high prominency of diabetes if that's the root cause of it is grief and loss? If we look out through history, we have a lot that we experience loss with. We have a lot to grieve. We lost our languages. We lost our land. We lost our way of life. Lost. So it makes sense why we're the ones that are showing a lot of dietary issues, correct? So I encourage you to look at that. Switch for me, please. So, Indigenous approaches to athleticism. These are 7 sacred teachings. Everybody's familiar. Anybody not familiar? All right, because this, like, we can go over this for the rest of the summer. But everybody knows what they are: love, truth, wisdom, humility, honesty, courage, and respect. These are things that need to be present in a young person's life. They need to be present in everyone's life. These are our teachings. These are how we govern our development, govern our families. And this is what we'll always come back to when we're in trouble. Usually one of these things is being absent from our life, or we're missing it in some way, and it needs to be instilled so that we can move forward. I can switch a slide for me. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about my foundation. So here's how the rest of the presentation is work. Is we're going to go through some stories. I'm going to tell you a lot about my experiences, my family, involved in my life, and in the end, we're going to talk about how this has driven me to come to where I am. So my grandparents are Lynette and Fisher. This was all of us many years ago, because you know what? This is my little brother right here. We're 18 years apart, and he is turning 20. So this was all of us outside of Regina powwow when we had all taken up powwow dancing. And I will also tell you, we used to be very active with horses. We used to ride a lot, we used to barrel race. We had ropers in our family, gincana, all kinds of stuff. It was horses. And then we had decided to reconnect with our Indigenous identity, and we wanted to dance. We wanted to be powwow dancers. Because us being from Chippewa, the Thames in southern Ontario, and growing up in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, meant we were completely disconnected from our Anishinaabe roots. We were actually in the middle of Cree territory. So no one could help us. We had those identity issues. There was no one there to teach us our language. Teaching. We had my grandparents, but they had moved to Moose Jaw. My mother was 10 years old in Moose Jaw. So we were very disconnected. All we knew from what Moose Jaw had was that we were Indians, and we weren't going to be. That's what we knew. It was a small community. I believe actually Moose Jaw was the KKK capital of Saskatchewan. Interesting. I didn't know that until many years later, but it made sense why I was treated some of the ways I was treated at that time because of that. I can switch forward, please. So, family foundation. These two people right here, my grandmother and my grandfather, they had such an impact on my life. So my grandfather raised 11 children, none being biological kids. My grandmother had all of her children with my paternal grandfather, who was an extremely abusive man, was a veteran, but extremely abusive. When he had passed away, she had met the grandfather I know, Wayne Henry, and he had taken on all of these children. And so he raised us all. I remember watching my grandfather work out. So I used to think he was like Bruce Lee. He was amazing. He was amazing. So as a young child, we'd be watching him these medicine balls, and he would be throwing them big medicine balls. And like as kids, we couldn't wait to do it big enough. We wanted to do that, right? He would skip rope, he would run, he would do all of these things. And I remember as a young child thinking that because he worked so hard, always working. And he was taking care of all these kids. And as a young person, I even understood then that there was something special about it. Because my father wanted me. I didn't know my father. He left when I was a baby, and he had never ever turned back. So as a young child, for me to understand men can do that, that was my perception. So men can do that. This one didn't. He stepped in and raised many children that weren't his, took responsibility for us all. So in my mind, as I was watching him, I thought, here's someone who deserves to be blessed, because that's a lot of work. And I remember talking to him and asking him, his grandfather was older. He's an old man. Look at all these flips he's doing. He's really good in karate and judo. He's a martial artist. I always wanted him to just rest. I wanted him to relax. I wanted that as a child. And so when I would talk to him about it and ask him, Mushroom, how come you do that stuff? How come you run and bike? And he said, because nobody has to come and take care of this. Nobody has to tell me to get up and get these things done. This is how I stay strong. This is me looking after myself. And that was something that always stuck with me. My grandmother bought horses when she was in her late 40s and started teaching us to ride horses. None of the horses she bought were beginner horses. These are not horses that I would ever put a beginner on. And she did that on her own. She bought these horses, she brought them home, they were used, they were broken, they were and bad attitudes. And one by one, she would take us kids out and she would put us on these horses. I was having such a terrible time in school, in elementary school. Lots of racism, lots of violence, and I was starting to become angry by the time I was 8 years old. I was very angry. And what I wouldn't give as an adult today when I'm having a bad day to get a phone call that Lynette Fisher used to meet her grandmother in the parking lot, and when I go outside there, she'd be sitting there with horses because we had an appointment. I'm like, Grandma, you know they can see you from the office and you bring your horses, right? You don't have an appointment. She's like, yeah. You know, that's how she saved me. That's how she started working with me because I wasn't good with people. As a child, I wasn't good with people. I had a lot of stuff for me. I had a lot of deep spiritual rejection as a child that was imposed on me because of the relationship that my parents had or didn't. So what she did was she taught me how to communicate through horses. She taught me how to be around these powerful animals and not rely on my voice, but rely on my energy. So she taught me a whole language that a lot of kids didn't get to learn. Right? Man, kids be talking a lot. Our foundation, this man right here told me, unless you have something intelligent to say, you need to keep quiet. And we respected that. We respected it. Because he taught us that, you know, you could be making all the noise and not make any sense. Really, not be making any sense. We also had teachings that when these two were talking, we left the room. You know, we didn't dare jump up there and, hold on, can I have? When these two were talking, we silently waited for them to be done. That was the respect that they had. They taught us about that and understanding the place in the world, understanding who we were as children, and following those teachings. They had all the time in the world for you. They would make all the time in the world for you to talk to you, to show you things, teach you things. Right? When I was little, I was terrified of horses. And my woman used to take me around all day and I'd just cry. 6 hours on horseback, just crying. You know, and as someone who's worked in wrangling and taken trail rides out myself, when I have kids crying, like, how did she do this every day? And she never left me home. Like, that's a lot of love, and that's a lot of patience in that kids. These kids, I'm so patient with them, you know, but I'm like, I cried for years. I cried for years on the back of the horse. I always wanted to go again. But I would cry and cry and cry. It wasn't until much later that I understood that those horses were pulling something out of me. That was the place where I felt I could let go of these emotions, even though I didn't understand them. You can put this slide for me, please. So many teachings. Here's my mother, raised me as a single mom, 2 degrees. She's got a degree in social work and she's got a degree in Indigenous studies. My mother was sober my entire life. She was never involved in addictions. I never saw her date anybody until I was 15, 16 years old. All I knew from this woman was when there was something to get done, you get it. An unsurmountable amount of strength. That there is a picture of 10 speed, not the exact 10 speed, but I hate those bikes. So when I was a child growing up with my mother in Regina, like I said, my family was in Moose Jaw, born and raised, moved to Regina so that she could attend university. And I'd ride on the handlebars, one of those, 3 to 4 times a day to university because my mother had to get to class. Also, her younger sisters, 2 aunties living with us at the time, they were also in university, and we all had to share that bike. So I hated it. I hated it because, you know, I'd just be young and she'd keep me there late and she'd have to write papers and fall asleep on the 10 speed going home, right? And she'd, hey, wake up. And fall over, she would run me over. Right? So she used to share a bike like this with her sister. Well, she got her degree. And I remember being so happy when somebody had gifted me a bike. I think it was like grade 1. And I was like, yes. no more 10 speed. Then I discovered how much my legs were trying to keep up with pedals at university. We're not talking the 10, 15 feet up. It took us a while. It took us a while. As an adult, when I've been back to Regina, I've gone and driven that path in my truck, my car. You can switch it, please. This is my best friend. This is David Curry, who's 2 years older than me, my brother. We don't have words for cousins in our languages. We were raised together. David was born completely deaf. He was born premature. And he was the one who taught me sign language. Again, learning how to communicate with other voice. So we have very, very little. You should have seen the arguments we would have. It was all hands and you knew, right? But we had a language that only we could understand. And my grandfather was the one that taught me, whenever we were out playing, whenever we went somewhere, that I had to hear for two people. So as a kid, if we were going to cross the street, I had to look for me. And so that caretaking, that looking after someone, right? That was really, really important. That was something that I grew up. So with such a strong foundation, with such a strong mother, there was never addicted. Strong teaching from grandparents, a good family. How did I experience, why did I become so angry? How did I experience sexual assault when I was so protected? Why did I become so violent as a young person? Falling into my own addictions, struggling with my own mental health, going through many, many injustices, and going for years as a young person feeling a deep-seated hate for everything around me. So what it was for me was that trauma, all of that. So I grew up in poverty. My mother worked very, very hard, but we were hungry. We didn't have a phone. Lots of times we didn't have power. And I remember my mom writing papers by candlelight because there was no power in the house. Those bike rides to the university were absolutely atrocious when you were a kid and you got an empty stomach. So a lot of times we went hungry. And even though we had horses were a lot cheaper to keep. They were there for the money that they required back. But for $40 a month, you could have these horses, right? Where I spent a lot of my time. But I would spend 12, 13 hours a day out there on horses and not eat. Because there was nothing at home to pack anyway, right? There was nothing at home for me to take. And my mom being so busy, she didn't know any better. She was a young mom. And she didn't have a routine. She didn't have consistency. There wasn't a supper time in our house because we operated in survival. I grew up in survival. That's how I grew up. Always growing up in survival mode, always having to protect myself. And what does that create in a young woman who doesn't feel accepted, doesn't feel loved, doesn't feel heard? And on top of that was actually being targeted for violence, sexual abuse, sexual assault. So what happened to me was I became very, very reactive. You could put me around horses, and I was a completely different individual. But you put me in school, you put me in any situation where I was uncomfortable, I was extremely reactive. And that was the only way that I could. And yes, my mother and I have had conversations about how did she become a child protection worker and not see it under her own nose, the stuff that was happening to her. How was she not able to fix me? How was she not able to help me? Because though I had this strong foundation, there was a lot of stuff. We had addictions, we had poverty, we had violence, and we were the target of many of those things growing up in the non-Indigenous community. So there was a lot of things that though I loved my childhood, I'm very, very happy that I survived it. Because there was a lot of things that I didn't think I was going to survive. And many, many times. And a lot of people didn't think I survived it in society. So, after, like I mentioned before, becoming addicted at 13 years old, from 13 to about 19, it was absolute hell on wheels. Horses were present in my life, But how was you also remember when I said I was 10 years old and I was tired of life, I was tired of being hungry, I was tired of being alone. Though I had family around all the time, mother and I didn't have the connection that I needed at that time. You know, and like I said, I'm not here to tell you my mom did a bad job, because she did a damn good job with what she had. But it has taken me a long journey into grief and trauma to realize the grief and trauma that I experienced as a child, not what I'm experiencing today. My grandmother, at one point, my grandmother is a Christian. Bless her, she is the most amazing artist I've ever seen. By that, I mean she is the lead singer, lead vocalist of her own band. She's 90 years old, and she still does gigs at the old folks' home. And it just blows my mind, you know, because she's got her band and she, you know, she'll tell me, oh, I have a show coming up. I'm like, no, from these people, they're like some of them are like 3 years younger than you. They're entertaining. It's amazing, right? She will also, that woman has no fear. She will walk into any dive bar and start belting on gospel music. And it just floors me. She's absolutely amazing. She saved me many, many times in my life. So her being a Christian woman came to me one day when I was 17 years old. And she said, I made you something. I made you something. And if there's any of you left in there that I helped raise, you'll stop selling drugs. You'll stop getting arrested. And you'll make something of yourself. And she handed me this bag and she left. What was in that bag was my first fancy shower. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to be Indian. I didn't know what that meant. All I knew was what society told me. All I knew was the violence. All I knew was the addictions, the anger. That's all I knew. I didn't know how to do any of that. But I started taking these steps forward. I had people step in and help me. And at 18 years old, when you have a body that's been built with substances for years and years, that's a difficult thing to step out on the dance floor and try to make your body move. Very, very difficult. But she did that. Not just once, but many times she stepped into my life and she pulled me down. She pulled me out of the depths of whatever I was experiencing by pushing me to be better, by pushing me to be physically active. At another time in my life, actually a couple years after this, I was in a bad relationship. And I'm not going on, right? We're all friends. My first marriage, I was married to a gentleman, wanted to continue drinking, wanted to continue that lifestyle. I did not. And as a result of the pressure and all of the stuff and all the grief and trauma that kept coming up in my life, because now I'm in my early 20s and it's not working, I became very, very ill and hospitalized. My grandmother came and took me away from my husband and said, you don't know how to help her. I'm going to help her. So she took me out to the farm, and her and my grandfather had me stack tractor tires for 3 days. Take them from one side of the yard, go from one end. And when I say I was sick at the time, I was non-verbal for about 2 months. I didn't speak for 2 months. And I had actually looked like I had severe addiction issues, even though I was 3 years clean. My body would just shake. Remember what I told you about the tremors? I would sit there and my body would just shake. I was an absolute wreck. But I respected my grandmother because of those foundational teachings. Respect. What she told me to do, I'd get up and I'd do it. Stacked all those tires 3 days up against the side of the mountain. And she'd come out. Oh, let's put them across the yard. Okay. Take them over across the yard. Finish that. Then she phoned the gravel truck. Tells the gravel truck, bring me $300 worth of gravel. So he brings it, right? And usually does the driveway. Drop the gravel beside the house. So this truck dumps all this gravel. She gives me a 5-gallon bucket and we do it out. Re-gravel the driveway. Ooh, that took a long time. Sometime later, I understood that my mother was working the stress out of my body. She didn't ask me what was wrong. She didn't, how are you feeling today? What do you want to talk about? Those are all very, very helpful things, but she could tell that the grief and the trauma was so deep that it was in my nervous system. So she created motion in my body, created strength, created sweat, and it started to come out, and it became better. And switch this back on you. Maybe I was able to learn. So after I was come out of that place of being so ill, I went back to school because I dropped out in grade 11 to participate in selling marijuana because I was hungry. I only needed money. But I went back and I got my grade 12 with the highest provincial average. And I was amazed because I had a horrific experience in school. Nobody believed me. Teachers didn't pay attention to me. They didn't support me. So I was amazed that I could accomplish something. This year is my auntie who took me under her wing and started teaching me how to do sun dancing. And so I've done 16 years of sun dancing under her direction. And her, just like my mom and my uncle, was very, very tough on me. I remember my first sun dance. There was an older lady beside me, and she said, "Is this your first time dancing?" "Yeah, it is." She was really scared, right? And she said, "Here's a scarf," and she showed me how to wrap my scarf around my skull and hang on to it. And she said, "You can use this when you dance. This will help you stay strong." I was so grateful for this old lady. Thank you, how kind. And my auntie come along and she said, "What's that?" And I said, "This is helping me so that I stay strong." And she said, "Take your hands off that." So I took it off and she pulled it off and she gave it back to that lady. You carry your own weight. Nothing can help you in here. You have to use your mind. You have to dig deep. You have to find your strength. That's what will get you through. I was really heartbroken. I was like, "Oh man, this is really." I gave it back to her, right? It's kind of upset with her because I needed some kindness. I needed to know I was okay. I was kind of upset with her for doing it. But that's how she was taught me. That's how my mother taught me. The only time my mother ever made me a lunch was the first time she was showing me how to do it. That was it. She didn't pack my clothes for me. She didn't do my laundry. She didn't do that stuff. She taught me to be independent. I had to grow up fast. I was growing up being raised with me. I didn't get that love that I needed as a child. So I got something different than a lot of people. And switch that. So we're gonna stop that because I need to share this really, really quickly. Sorry, this is a lot to share. So this here is the love of my life. These are my 4 children and my husband. My husband is here at the back. And I want to point him out at this time so that he's not single. There are a lot of beautiful women on the island here. It's not available. So when I met my husband, in university. Both of us coming out of severely traumatized childhoods and traumatic life at the time. My husband experienced a lot of things being raised by a residential school survivor, was also having a lot of his own addiction issues. I'm not going to share a lot of that because that's his story to share, but let me tell you what I did. These are my athletes. These are my first 2 sincere case studies that I have long-term supported in athletics. My husband, when I met him, had not been on the ice in 15 years. He's one of the most gifted hockey players that I have ever seen, understands the game in a beautiful way. So when I met him and he used to talk to me about skating all the time, and I was like, there's no reason why you can't now. There's rec leagues. I've seen Musham's older than you and they're still giving her. You can do this. Believe in you. And he was really unsure of himself. And I took him to Sport Check. And we didn't have a lot of money because we were students at the time. But before I took him to Sport Check, he's like, "I'll just wear my old equipment." I was like, "When last did you put that on?" "Well, 15 years ago." "Oh, okay." And so he puts it all on, right? Oh my goodness, it was pretty tight. It's pretty tight, and he come out with I don't want to embarrass him for anybody here, but nowadays, our jocks and Jills, I'm a martial artist as well, they come in shorts, right? You can just pull them up. So his was like the old school strap. And I was like, "Jeez, what the hell is that?" "This is my cup." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, they make different ones now. You can get rid of that." And he's like, "Oh, I'll give it to some kid who needs it." I was like, "I don't think you should be like that." That's how he is. He looks to keep everything in case someone needs it. And so he went to his first game, and his his phone was like sliding out of his helmet, and he kept having his shoulder down. Right? I think it was real tight like that. He got himself a $20 stick from Canadian Tire. So he comes off the ice, and I was feeling pretty rough, and I wasn't having it, because I remember being young like that and not having one and investing in me. Right? I said, okay, so we went to Sport Check on January. There you go. So yeah, he argued with me about his skates. He had old school skates, real called like real heavy. And I'm not out there. It's like, you know, the big fiberglass skates now, they look just fast. And he's like, no, this one's good on my legs. Just try them. And I took his Canadian Tire stick away because he's telling me my wrist really hurt. He's like saying, right? I was like, well, it's part of that burn stick you're trying to Well, nowadays, like the technology is different. Like there's flex, you know, because I managed the team in Regina, so I understood some things. So 9 years later, he had put down the volleyball. We have all of his kids in our care, raising them together. And just about 6 weeks ago, that man played 5 games in 1 day. 9 games. This year is our son who's up and coming. One of our son's favorite things, and I'll tell you that because we push hard. We push nutrition, we push discipline, we push consistency, right? And we push big and deep. All based on that indigenous approach to athleticism. That respect, that honesty, that truth, that courage. These are the things that we push. This is what gets people off the couch and back up. Despite injuries, my husband has suffered from arthritis since he was a young child. Okay? Those are one of the things. Combine that with some addictions, some bad lifestyle choices, some trauma, and some grief, can really silence. Now he's living his best life. I'm sick of hockey personally, but I continue to go and support them every weekend, everywhere that we can go. My husband also taught me to golf. I refused to golf at one point in my life because I believed that it was a white man sport for upper class white men. It was nothing to do with it. I refused, right? He took the time to teach it to me and show it to me in a way that allowed me to golf from the games, which is kind of funny. So these are our 5 methods. This is what it takes. I mentioned that. I'm not going to go deep into it. If you want to know, you can come and ask me. I'll show you some. Sorry, I kind of have to rush this here. That was me in 2021. So even though I knew all that stuff, and I was training athletes and I was being successful, had a degree, was sober, how did I become sick like that? How did I become overweight, depressed, riddled with anxiety, digestion issues, headaches, you name it? I was having a lot of problems. This is what happened in 2016. I broke my wrist. So that was 2021. Tracing it back to grief and trauma. 2016, I shattered my wrist, needed a surgery. That's how it looked if my husband wouldn't do my hair in the morning. So my husband was in charge of putting aside ponytail because that's all he could do. I was fine. He did get mad at me once, left the house and didn't do my hair. I've forgiven him. It's pretty mean thing to do. That's how I looked if he didn't help me out. Switch to strategy. That break happened a month before you remember my brother here in Paris. A month before he passed away in a car accident behind teacher. I was completely broken at the time. That was the worst amount of grief I had ever. The sexual assault that I experienced, the violence that I experienced at the hands of police officers and teachers and adults, people that I trusted, those beatings, nothing compared to the sorry, of the phone call I got from Jesus God. Here's what she said. That's what got me to that place when I was sick. In July 21, I was 216 pounds. I had a back injury at the time. I had severe IBS, something that I struggled with daily from being starved as a child, not intentionally, but not having the right food consistently. High amounts of cortisol in blood, unresolved grief and trauma. That's how I got up to 216 pounds. This is Oh, sorry. So methodologies. Back in, I remember laying on the floor and my husband was there. I prayed the Creator to take that pain. I couldn't understand why for 11 days I was stuck on the floor. When Creator had given me so many blessings in my life, we simply have to ask. You know, Creator, we need a place to live. Where am I going to raise these kids? Show me where I'm going. Creator, can you bless me with the knowledge of knowing which job I should take? I'm not sure. All of these things He had done. Many, many people healed around me from prayers, but He would not take my back. And I was angry and I was upset. Why couldn't I get better? Here's why I couldn't get better. Is because had He taken that pain away from me, had He healed my back at the time that I was crying out for Him to do so, I wouldn't be where I'm at now, which is at 150 pounds, headed for my first bodybuilding competition in 3 weeks. So I train 15 to 16 hours a week, and that's 5 days. So I'm up at 3:30 in the morning. I'm in the gym by 4. I train until 6 a.m. I come home, get ready, wake up my husband, we go to work, we teach on the nation. We come back to town, and I'm back in the gym. This is not a pace that you can keep up. It is unrealistic unless you're in bodybuilding to spend this amount of time. But when I started to heal, we use natural medicine, we use clean nutrition, I have good coaching, and I put down the grind, the grind, the grind. So grief and trauma makes us search for a place where we can feel comfortable. Right? Remember I talked about that escapism to addictions? Any amount of grief and trauma and sorrow, the human brain is hardwired to find the easiest way to do things. And when we're not feeling well, how many of you have a certain blanket that you're in your house? Right? Depending on what you need to do, you have an idea of which shoes you want. Comfort things, right? That's how the brain works. But when it comes to stepping out of grief and trauma, there's something that you got to dig deep. Very, very deep. And that is learning to be okay with being uncomfortable. I have not been comfortable with my life. And I understand that. I've never been comfortable with my entire life. But now I'm in control. That's different. I'm sore every day. I'm tired every day. But that body that was sexually assaulted, I took that. And I put strength into it. Those meals that I didn't get as a child, I now battle that with clean nutrition. I'm feeding my body what it needs. I've got that education. I understand about allergen foods. I understand about fueling the body for the activity that it needs. Really, really taking care of myself. So I went hungry as a child, so I've spent the last 2 years healing my inner child by eating the food. These are the things that I've been doing. Coaching. I've received a very, very extensive amount of coaching that has really upped my game and my education on how to train, combined with my own experiences. And that's what I look forward to, is launching our business of Fair Time Athletics and becoming a coach. From somebody from the standpoint of someone who's been down. Because when you're uncomfortable, when you're hurting, when you're carrying a thought, you need someone that's going to be able to recognize, hey, you got you, not I got you. You got you. You can do this. You can do this. Maybe not today, but we don't give up. We get up and try and keep working towards it. This is what our First Nations do. The kindness we can get anywhere, but kindness doesn't get you out of your comfort zone. It doesn't. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be kind, right? I'm not saying you shouldn't be kind to yourself. I'm not saying you shouldn't be kind to your students. But I've seen a lot of our young First Nations athletes go on the ice and they're angry. They are angry kids. You know, they're lashing out. If you're like me, I went through ceremony, I went through counseling, I did all of that, I learned to forgive. I learned to understand why I was angry. But at the end of it all, and that was what I couldn't get out of my body. I got rid of everything else, but I couldn't get out the anger. So I don't believe that I'm the only one that has to put it in me. And every time that I was working out, every time I would drop 5 pounds, I would go to the gym and go, you're down another 5, you're down another 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, up to 70 pounds. And it's not about the weight that I lost, because when I saw this, I didn't see measurements of fat. I saw there's some stuff you're not angry about. There's some stuff you're not afraid of anymore. There is some beliefs about yourself that people put in your head. These doubts that were spoken over you, spoken over your name, put in front of you, and none of it is the lightness that I was able to feel through training, through having this Indigenous perspective, to bringing that to athleticism and bringing that to my coaching and bringing that to people who are struggling and being able to create that space and that understanding. You know, when I'm helping someone who's working out and I see them struggling, I'll get down there with them. We'll do this together. But you will not quit. I won't let you quit on this. Can you switch one more slide? Remember I said my beliefs against people? That man back there, they're going to be a club champion. Proper coaching, proper perspectives, not giving up, right? Under his coaching, I was able to accomplish that. There's what I'm competing against. A lot of respect for women and my fellow sisters. I'll never compete against you. I want to lift you up. I want to stand beside you, but I will compete against that guy. So this is me and my check-in school. If you remember the news report. So where am I headed? I'm headed to the Natural Physics Association of Alberta, competing in figure bodybuilding. This is a big thing for me to get up on stage in these right here. I blew all my ligaments in 2012. They don't consider women like us when they say you gotta wear these shoes. These are what you have to wear. Also, the bikini that I have to buy is a lot less than the bikini. Yeah, I thought it was like a swimsuit. It's not. It's not. And it's very, very expensive. So my husband took me in when we went to order it and stuff. I told him, I was like, hey, this was $500. I'll spend that on golf. I won't. Or my truck. But clothing, right? Because I grew up in the poverty. This is big for me. I was like, so this summer, if you all see me and I'm grocery shopping and I'm wearing my bikini, I'm on the golf course and that's what I'm wearing. Just mind your business. I'm just getting my money's worth. Also, being out there and having my body, that's what it comes down to, right? Having my body judged. That's a tough thing for a First Nation woman who's been in target for sexual assault, abuse, and violence for whole life. But it's okay, because I want to leave you with this. I've already won. I won every morning that I've got up at 3:30 and I've gone to the gym, whether I was lonely, whether I was sore, whether I was tired, whether I was angry. There were times when I was in tears, lifting weights, thinking I hurt myself. But it was actually grief that I had felt somewhere down. Crying because I was pushing on the bottom. I would come in tears. It had been buried in there for years, years and years. So when I go on that stage, what I'm going to remember is the face of every First Nation woman that I have looked into her eyes, seeing a broken and abused woman who's struggling, who's trying to make it, her children who are relying on her. When I go on that stage, I'm taking a space for us all of us who have experienced that in our life. We can overcome these things, but we have to dig deep. You have to dig deep. There's tools out there, there's counseling, there's nutrition, there's ceremonies, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, when you're on your knees, not knowing how you're going to get up, you got to dig deep, you got to believe in yourself. That's what you have to go to. That was the hardest thing for me, was to stop looking for comfort outside of myself and in other things, and waiting for my dad to come back, and wanting my husband to fix everything, and wanting my kids to make me the mother that I never had, wanting my relationship with my mother to be better, for her to realize how many times she could have showed me love, but she didn't. All of those things that I was waiting for outside of myself, stop doing them. Stop doing them. And I dug down deep and I started giving into myself. And this is the result. This is where I'm going. So when I'm on that stage, it doesn't matter if they hand me a medal or not, because I'm not there for that. I'm there to put in that space for this. For everyone who's ever experienced that, to say, I'm worth something. I can heal myself. I will do it. And if you're ever in that dark crease, that's what I want you to remember. Dig deep, because it's in there. The brain is hardwired to tell you to find the easiest way. The heart is hardwired. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, everyone. On behalf of Lynette Fisher and the Indigenous Physical Activity and Cultural Circle, I would like to thank everyone for attending this valuable presentation this morning. We will have a 10-minute break before our next presentation starts at 10:55. And for those who are joining us online, please leave the breakout room and join the main conference room to change the next session. Thank you once again, everyone.
I got a comment. First and foremost, I think the presentation was well delivered. From where you were to where you are, you found the secret. Be able to take the sort of armor off and talk about your feelings. Because you matter your feelings. What I've learned, and this new word is 30%. We all have a little church inside of us. That's 30%. What you've done, you did your homework. The 80%. It's good. We pray. That's only 30%. Actually, it's 80% of the work that we have to do. Land these teachings. Where you balanced your life. I commend you for doing what you went. Spreading that word. Let's see what it is. Be able to express how you feel. The hardest thing is be able to murder. We're too hard on ourselves. We need to love ourselves. Because we need that. With that, I receive gracias. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.